For years, a large number of women built their expectations around the idea that men would spend money on them by default, whether that meant meals, gifts, transportation, entertainment, or lifestyle support. That dynamic existed not because it was written into law, not because it was biologically required, but because enough men were willing to participate in it without asking hard questions about what they were receiving in return. That willingness did not come from confidence or abundance in most cases. It came from social pressure, fear of being judged, fear of being labeled negatively, fear of missing out on companionship, and fear of being seen as inadequate. Over time, this created what many people now refer to as a simp economy, a system where men were expected to give resources while receiving little more than attention or validation in return. The important thing to understand is that the system was never stable because it relied on one side continuously giving while being told that their expectations, boundaries, and needs were either outdated or inappropriate. In China, this dynamic reached a particularly intense level due to a combination of economic pressures, demographic imbalances, and rapidly changing social norms. Large numbers of men were competing in a system where the cost of participation kept rising while the rewards became increasingly abstract. Lavish spending on dates, gifts, and status symbols became normalized, while men were simultaneously told that expressing dissatisfaction with this arrangement meant they were immature, unsuccessful, or lacking ambition. The unspoken rule was simple: spend without complaint or step aside quietly. What has changed now is not that men suddenly became selfish, hostile, or bitter. What changed is that economic reality finally caught up with social fantasy. Rising living costs, housing pressure, job instability, and long term financial uncertainty forced many men to look at their budgets honestly. When that happened, a very simple question emerged: what am I actually getting for what I am spending, and does this make sense for my future? For an increasing number of men, the answer was no. So men adjusted. They did not organize protests. They did not demand apologies. They did not ask for permission. They simply stopped spending. They stopped paying for meals by default. They stopped giving gifts without meaningful relationships. They stopped funding lifestyles that were not their responsibility. They redirected their money toward themselves, toward savings, toward personal development, toward hobbies, toward peace. This was not a political statement, it was a financial decision. The reaction to the shift has been revealing. Instead of self reflection, many of the loudest voices responded with anger and ridicule. Men who declined to pay were labeled broke. Men who suggested splitting costs were called immature. Men who chose solitude over financial imbalance were mocked as failures. Yet at the same time, many of the people making these accusations openly admitted that they could not afford basic expenses on their own. A $30 meal became a symbol of injustice. A short ride across town became evidence of oppression. The contradiction was impossible to miss. This is where the conversation becomes uncomfortable because it forces accountability back onto individuals instead of systems. For decades, men were told not to approach, not to initiate, not to expect, not to lead, and not to complain. Men were told they were not needed, that independence was the goal, and that reliance on men was outdated. Many men listened, they adjusted their behavior, they stepped back. Now that those same men have stepped away financially as well, the response is shock rather than recognition. What we are seeing is not men abandoning society, it is men finally applying the same standards to their resources that they were told to apply to their presence. If you do not need me, then you do not need my money either. That is the unspoken logic driving this shift. It is calm, consistent, and difficult to argue against without contradicting years of messaging about independence and equality. The deeper issue here is dependency disguised as empowerment. A system that celebrates autonomy while quietly expecting someone else to foot the bill is not empowerment. It is selective responsibility. When economic conditions were forgiving, this contradiction could be ignored. Now that conditions are tightening, it is being exposed. Hard times do not create new values, they reveal existing ones. Men who walked away did not do so in anger, they did it in search of peace. Many found that solitude was less expensive, less stressful, and more predictable than navigating expectations that were never clearly defined but always strictly enforced. When you remove constant financial obligation, something interesting happens. You gain clarity, you gain time, you gain control over your future. That is a powerful incentive to stay gone. This does not mean all relationships are transactional or that generosity has no place. It means generosity without reciprocity eventually becomes unsustainable. A healthy system requires balance, appreciation, and mutual effort. When one side is told their only role is to give while being criticized for expecting anything in return, disengagement becomes the rational response. What makes this moment different is that men are not waiting to be invited back. They are not negotiating terms. They are not seeking validation for their decision. They are simply opting out and reallocating their resources. That is why this shift feels so abrupt to those who benefited from the previous arrangement. The foundation disappeared quietly, and now the structure above it is cracking. There is an important lesson here for everyone, regardless of gender or background. Economic reality always wins. Social narratives can delay it, disguise it, or soften it, but they cannot override it forever. When people can no longer afford to participate in an arrangement, they will leave it no matter how normalized it once was. Expecting rescue during hard times from people you dismissed during good times is not a strategy. It is a gamble. And that gamble is no longer paying off. For men, the lesson has already been learned. Protect your resources, invest in yourself, build stability before offering support to others. For women facing this shift, the path forward is not outrage, but adaptation. Independence means being able to stand on your own when circumstances change. Growth comes from adjusting expectations to match reality, not from demanding that reality bend back to old assumptions. This moment is not about blame, it is about consequences. Choices made over decades shape outcomes during crises. Men were told to step back, so they did. They found peace there, and peace is hard to give up once discovered. No one is coming to rescue anyone from the results of their own decisions. That era is over. Hey guys, in a world pushing you to own nothing and be happy, crypto is your key to survival. Join Angry's Crypto Academy to master buying, selling, and trading crypto. Make huge profits and safeguard your wealth. Plus, discover the one crypto virtually no one is talking about, poised to create new millionaires in the upcoming bull run. The link is in the description of the video below. Go check it out now. As we move deeper into economic uncertainty, these dynamics will only become more pronounced. Spending will become more intentional. Relationships will be evaluated more carefully. People will prioritize stability over appearances. Those who adapt will survive. Those who cling to outdated expectations will struggle. To understand why this shift feels so sudden to some people, you have to look at how long the groundwork was being laid beneath the surface. This did not begin last year or even 5 years ago. This began decades ago when social expectations started drifting away from economic realities. Men were gradually trained to believe that their value was tied to what they could provide financially, while simultaneously being told that their opinions, preferences, and boundaries were outdated or unnecessary. That contradiction could only survive as long as resources were abundant and optimism was high. Once scarcity entered the equation, the illusion collapsed. For a long time, many men accepted financial imbalance as the cost of participation. They were told that effort would eventually be rewarded, that patience would be recognized, and that generosity would be appreciated. But appreciation without reciprocity eventually feels hollow. Over time, men began to notice that their spending was expected but never acknowledged as meaningful. Paying for a meal was not considered kind, it was considered mandatory. Giving gifts was not seen as generous, it was seen as baseline behavior. When generosity becomes obligation, resentment is never far behind. In China, this dynamic was amplified by structural pressures that made competition more intense and outcomes more uncertain. High housing costs, demanding work schedules, and a shrinking margin for error forced men to become more pragmatic. Spending money on symbolic gestures stopped making sense when those same resources were needed for rent, healthcare, and long term security. When survival competes with symbolism, survival wins every time. What makes this moment particularly revealing is how many people are treating the loss of optional spending as a moral failure rather than a practical decision. Men who choose not to spend are not doing anything wrong. They are responding logically to incentives and constraints. When you remove the expectation of a mutual benefit, you remove the incentive to invest. This is not cruelty, it is cause and effect. Another element that deserves attention is how social media accelerated the collapse rather than causing it. Platforms did not invent these expectations, they simply broadcast them at scale. Videos and posts openly mocking men for not spending money exposed a level of entitlement that had previously been more subtle. When people publicly demand financial support while offering nothing in return, it forces observers to confront the imbalance directly. Many men watching these exchanges reach the same conclusion. This arrangement does not serve me. At the same time, social media also gave men something they had lacked before: visibility into alternatives. They could see other men choosing solitude, investing in themselves, focusing on health, finances, and hobbies, and appearing calmer and more stable as a result. That visibility made walking away feel less isolating. When you realize you are not alone, decisions become easier. One of the most important shifts happening right now is psychological rather than financial. Men are redefining success. For years, success was framed as external validation, romantic approval, and social recognition. Now, success is increasingly defined as peace, control, and predictability. That redefinition changes everything. If your goal is peace, then removing unnecessary financial stress becomes an obvious step. If your goal is control, then avoiding situations where expectations are unclear becomes a priority. This is why the backlash feels so ineffective. Shame no longer works when the target no longer values the approval of the person applying it. Calling someone broke only matters if they care about impressing you. Calling someone immature only works if they want your validation. Men who have walked away have already opted out of that framework entirely. Another uncomfortable truth is that many men realize they were being evaluated primarily on what they could provide, not who they were. Once that realization sets in, continuing to participate feels self defeating. You begin to understand that no amount of spending will ever create genuine desire or respect if those things were not present to begin with. At that point, withdrawing resources becomes an act of self respect rather than punishment. It is also worth noting that the shift is not anti relationship or anti partnership, it is anti imbalance. Men are not refusing to spend money in all circumstances. They are refusing to spend money in situations where the exchange feels one sided, transactional, or coerced. When mutual interest, effort, and appreciation exist, generosity naturally follows. When those elements are absent, generosity dries up. The narrative that men are refusing to spend even a dime misses the point entirely. Men are spending more than ever on themselves. They are investing in education, fitness, technology, experiences, and financial security. They are not hoarding money out of fear. They are reallocating it based on revised priorities. That distinction matters. What makes this especially challenging for those who relied on the old system is that there is no lever to pull to reverse it. You cannot force someone to spend money voluntarily. You cannot shame someone into generosity when they no longer feel obligated. You cannot legislate attraction or enforce desire. Once someone decides that their resources are better used elsewhere, that decision is final. This is where the conversation often turns emotional because emotions are easier than introspection. It is easier to accuse men of being stingy than to ask whether expectations were ever reasonable. It is easier to blame economic conditions than to acknowledge personal dependency, but growth does not come from deflection. It comes from adaptation. Hard times are clarifying moments. They strip away assumptions and reveal what people truly value. When resources tighten, everyone is forced to prioritize. Men prioritized stability and autonomy. That choice did not come at random. It came after years of being told they were optional. Optional support leads to optional spending. And there's also a generational component here that cannot be ignored. Younger men watched older men work relentlessly only to receive little loyalty, security, or appreciation in return. They saw the cost of overinvesting in systems that did not protect them. Many decided early on that they would not repeat that pattern. Walking away was not an impulsive reaction, it was a preemptive strategy. As more men adopt this mindset, the ripple effects will extend beyond dating. Consumer behavior will change. Industries built around male spending on symbolic validation will shrink. Marketing narratives will shift. Financial independence will replace performative generosity as the new status signal. These changes are already underway, and they will accelerate as economic pressure increases. The uncomfortable reality is that no one owes anyone else financial support simply for existing. That idea only survives in environments where abundance masks imbalance. Once abundance fades, reality asserts itself. Mutual contribution becomes the baseline expectation rather than optional generosity. For those willing to adapt, this moment offers an opportunity. Building independence, resilience, and self sufficiency is empowering. It reduces vulnerability to external shocks and restores agency. For those unwilling to adapt, the coming years will feel increasingly hostile, not because society is cruel, but because expectations were misaligned with reality. Men who walked away did not do so to punish anyone, they did it to protect themselves. They found that peace was cheaper than participation and far more reliable. Once you experience that, going back feels unnecessary. When you zoom out far enough, what becomes clear is that this shift was not triggered by resentment, but by arithmetic. Numbers do not care about narratives. Budgets do not respond to moral pressure. Rent, food, transportation, and savings targets do not negotiate based on social expectations. When men began laying out their financial realities honestly, many realized that the traditional model they were expected to participate in was incompatible with long term stability. Once that realization set in, the decision to disengage became almost automatic. What makes this moment so significant is that men did not simply stop spending in one area. They began applying the same logic across their entire lives. They questioned why they were working overtime for lifestyles they were not building. They questioned why they were delaying personal goals to maintain appearances. They questioned why they were expected to absorb financial risk while being told their presence was optional. Those questions led to answers that were not emotionally satisfying to everyone, but they were internally consistent. For years, the message was clear. Independence meant not needing men. Strength meant self reliance. Equality meant shared responsibility. Men heard that message and adjusted accordingly. The problem was that the practical expectations never fully aligned with the rhetoric. Financial contribution remained expected even as emotional and social authority diminished. That imbalance could not survive indefinitely. As men began withdrawing financial participation, another dynamic surfaced. Many realized that their absence did not produce the chaos they were warned about. Society did not collapse. Daily life continued. In fact, many men found their own lives became calmer and more predictable. When fear based participation ends without disaster, the fear loses its power. That realization spread quietly but rapidly. One of the most revealing aspects of this transition is how quickly spending expectations were reframed once men stopped complying. What was once called generosity became redefined as obligation. What was once called courtesy became reframed as entitlement. This rhetorical shift exposed the underlying assumption that male resources were communal by default. When men rejected that assumption, it forced an uncomfortable confrontation with personal responsibility. Another factor accelerating this shift is the growing awareness that financial generosity does not guarantee emotional security. Many men spent years investing financially in relationships that offered no long term stability. When those relationships ended, they were left with depleted savings and few safeguards. Watching this pattern repeat across peer groups created a collective lesson. Emotional connection cannot be purchased, and attempting to do so often leads to regret. This is where solitude enters the conversation, not as a failure, but as an alternative. Solitude removes ambiguity, it removes financial expectation, it removes performance pressure. For many men, solitude offered something they had not experienced in years: silence without judgment, time without obligation, space to think without being evaluated. That experience recalibrated priorities in ways that no argument ever could. It is important to understand that walking away does not mean disengaging from society entirely. Men did not stop contributing to their communities, families, or personal growth. They simply became selective. Contribution became intentional rather than automatic. Support became conditional rather than assumed. That shift does not signal bitterness, it signals discernment. As more men adopt this mindset, the collective impact becomes visible. Dating norms change, conversations become more direct, expectations are clarified earlier. The idea that one party should carry the financial burden without discussion loses legitimacy. These changes may feel uncomfortable, but discomfort is often the precursor to healthier systems. What many people struggle to accept is that systems do not owe anyone comfort, they only respond to incentives. When men realized the incentives were misaligned, they adjusted their behavior. That adjustment did not require coordination or ideology, it required honesty. The idea that men will eventually return and resume spending out of necessity misunderstands what has changed. Men are not waiting for conditions to improve. They are building lives that no longer require participation in the old system. Once independence is established, dependency becomes unattractive in any form. This is why appeals to nostalgia fall flat. Reminding men of how things used to be does not address why they left. The past offered familiarity, not fulfillment. The present offers autonomy, even if it comes with solitude. For many, that trade off feels fair. There is also a broader economic lesson embedded here. When a large group reduces discretionary spending, markets adjust. Businesses that relied on that spending feel the impact. Cultural norms shift in response. This is not unique to dating or relationships. It happens whenever consumer behavior changes at scale. Men opting out of symbolic spending is simply another example of this principle at work. Those who adapt their expectations to this new reality will find stability. Those who cling to old assumptions will experience frustration. This is not a judgment, it is a forecast based on observable trends. The future will favor partnerships built on mutual contribution, transparency, and shared responsibility. Performative gestures will lose value. Financial honesty will gain importance. People will prioritize sustainability over spectacle. These changes will not reverse because they are rooted in economic necessity rather than ideology. Men who walked away did not do so with the expectation of praise. They did it quietly, methodically, and without fanfare. That is why the shift caught so many by surprise. There was no announcement, no movement, just absence. Absence has a way of revealing truths that presence can hide. When the spending stopped, the assumptions were exposed. When the gifts stopped, the dependency became visible. When the attention shifted inward, the imbalance became undeniable. And as we look ahead, the question is not whether this shift will continue, but how individuals will respond to it. Will expectations evolve to match reality, or will frustration escalate as old models fail to deliver old outcomes? The answer will shape the next decade of social interaction. At this stage, the conversation naturally shifts from reaction to reconstruction. Because once a system collapses, people are forced to ask what replaces it. Walking away is only the first phase. What follows is the slow and often uncomfortable process of redefining connection, value, and cooperation under new conditions. This is where the story becomes less about refusal and more about recalibration. One of the biggest misconceptions is that men walking away represents disengagement from human connection entirely. That assumption misunderstands what most men were actually seeking in the first place. The goal was never isolation for its own sake. The goal was fairness, clarity, and emotional safety. Solitude was not the objective, it was the refuge when those needs were not being met. When you remove chronic imbalance, people become more open, not less. But openness now comes with standards. What many men discovered during this period of withdrawal was that their lives became more orderly, finances stabilized, stress levels dropped, decision making improved. Without constant pressure to perform or provide, mental bandwidth returned. That mental space allowed reflection, and reflection led to discernment. Once discernment develops, it does not disappear simply because conditions change. This is why attempts to shame men back into participation have failed so consistently. Shame relies on internalized guilt. Discernment replaces guilt with boundaries. Boundaries are not emotional reactions, they are policies, and policies do not bend under emotional appeal. As men rebuilt their lives around stability rather than approval, something else happened. The updates, they became more selective about who they allowed close to them. That selectivity is often misinterpreted as coldness or arrogance, but it is neither. It is caution informed by experience. When you have paid a high price for unclear expectations, you become careful about entering new arrangements without explicit terms. This shift is forcing a broader cultural adjustment. The idea that attraction should override practicality is losing credibility. Chemistry alone is no longer enough. Compatibility now includes financial philosophy, personal responsibility, and long term alignment. These were always important, but they were often ignored when abundance made mistakes affordable. Scarcity changes priorities. Another important change is the growing rejection of performative generosity. Public displays of spending no longer signal success the way they once did. Quiet stability has become more attractive than visible excess. Men who manage their resources well are increasingly respected by peers, even if they are ignored by those who benefited from unchecked spending. Respect, unlike attention, compounds over time. There is also a psychological shift happening that deserves attention. Many men realized that they were not lonely because they lacked relationships. They were lonely because the relationships they had were conditional. Removing conditional connection creates space for authentic connection to emerge, even if it takes time. Quality replaces quantity. This is where the narrative often becomes uncomfortable for those who expected rescue. Rescue implies obligation. Obligation requires authority. Authority was relinquished when men were told they were not needed. You cannot dismiss someone's role and then demand its benefits later. That contradiction cannot be resolved emotionally. It must be resolved structurally. The future of relationships will not be built on nostalgia or entitlement. It will be built on mutual capability. Two people choosing each other because they want to, not because one needs the other to subsidize their lifestyle. That model is less dramatic but far more resilient. It produces fewer viral arguments and more sustainable outcomes. Men who walked away are not closing the door permanently. They are installing filters. They are willing to invest when investment makes sense. They are willing to support when support is reciprocal. But the days of blind spending in exchange for potential validation are over. This recalibration also changes how rejection is interpreted. When men no longer see rejection as catastrophic, they stop over investing to avoid it. When rejection no longer threatens identity, spending loses its leverage. This emotional decoupling is one of the most powerful changes happening right now, and it is largely invisible to those still operating under old assumptions. Another subtle but important development is the decline of urgency. Men no longer feel rushed to secure relationships at any cost. Time is no longer perceived as an enemy. This patience fundamentally alters negotiation dynamics. When you are willing to wait, you cannot be pressured easily. When pressure fails, expectations must adjust. This is not just happening in China. It is happening globally wherever economic pressure intersects with shifting social norms. The specifics vary by culture, but the pattern is consistent. When costs rise and returns diminish, participation declines. This is true in markets, careers, and relationships alike. What comes next will depend on who adapts faster. Those who embrace self sufficiency and mutual contribution will find opportunity. Those who cling to dependency models will experience frustration. This is not about winners and losers. It is about alignment. Men did not walk away to make a statement. They walked away to survive and eventually to thrive. Survival required retreat. Thriving requires reconstruction. That reconstruction is already underway, quietly and without spectacle. As we move further into uncertain economic terrain, clarity will become the most valuable currency. Clear expectations, clear boundaries, clear intentions. Ambiguity will be avoided because ambiguity is expensive. Misunderstandings cost time, money, and emotional energy. People will demand precision where there was once assumption. This will feel transactional to some, but it is actually the opposite. Transactions are clear. Manipulation thrives in vagueness. Clarity protects both parties. When expectations are explicit, disappointment decreases. When disappointment decreases, resentment fades. One of the great ironies of the shift is that it may ultimately lead to healthier relationships than the system it replaces. When no one is forced to perform, authenticity increases. When no one is pressured to subsidize, respect grows. When both parties can stand independently, partnership becomes a choice rather than a necessity. This is the direction things are moving, whether people like it or not. Economic reality does not ask for permission. It reshapes behavior until balance is restored. Once the emotional noise settles and the initial shock wears off, what remains is a quieter and more practical question. How does an individual live well in a landscape where old assumptions no longer hold? This is where the conversation stops being abstract and starts becoming personal. Walking away remove pressure, but it also remove familiar scripts. Without scripts, people must think. And thinking while uncomfortable at first, is the gateway to autonomy. For many men, the first stage after disengagement was rest, not physical rest alone, but cognitive rest. The absence of constant evaluation, expectation, and financial anticipation allowed nervous systems to recalibrate. Men who had lived in a near permanent state of low level anxiety realized that tension had become so normal they barely noticed it until it was gone. That realization alone validated the decision to step back. From that calm came reassessment. What do I actually want? Not what do I want to be seen wanting, not what do I want to impress others with, but what produces a stable and meaningful life. For some, the answer was career development. For others, health. For others, creative work, learning, travel, or simply quiet routines. The key point is that the answers were internally generated rather than socially imposed. This internal alignment is what makes reversal unlikely. When choices are made to escape discomfort, people often return to familiar patterns once the discomfort fades. But when choices are made to align life with values, they persist. Men who walked away did not do so to escape momentary frustration. They did it to realign their lives with sustainability and dignity. That alignment does not erode easily. Another important shift during this phase was the redefinition of generosity. Generosity stopped being automatic and became intentional. Men did not stop being kind, they stopped being indiscriminate. Support was offered where appreciation existed. Time was shared where respect was mutual. Money was spent where value was clear. This discernment transformed generosity from a liability into a strength. This is also where the myth of bitterness collapses. Bitterness thrives on unresolved emotion. Discernment thrives on resolution. Men who are bitter argue constantly. Men who are resolved move quietly. What we are witnessing is not widespread resentment, but widespread disengagement from dynamics that no longer serve personal well being. There is a tendency among observers to interpret disengagement as avoidance, but avoidance runs away from problems. Discernment walks past them. Men did not walk away from responsibility. They walked away from responsibility that was not reciprocal. That distinction matters. As individuals stabilized, they also began to recognize patterns they had previously ignored. They noticed how often their contributions were minimized. They noticed how expectations escalated without discussion. They noticed how quickly appreciation turned into entitlement. These patterns were always there, but constant participation obscured them. Distance revealed them. With clarity came boundaries, and boundaries changed interactions immediately. Conversations became shorter, but more honest. Invitations were evaluated rather than accepted reflexively. Financial decisions were made privately rather than performatively. This reduced friction and misunderstandings dramatically. One of the most profound changes during this phase was the shift in self perception. Men stopped seeing themselves as incomplete without external validation. Completion became internal. This internal completion made connection optional rather than necessary. Optional connection is healthier than compulsory connection, even if it is rarer. This recalibration also changed how men interpreted criticism. When your identity is no longer tied to approval, criticism loses much of its power. Being called names does not sting when the source no longer defines your worth. This emotional independence is perhaps the most destabilizing aspect of the shift for those accustomed to leverage through judgment. As this mindset spread, a new kind of quiet confidence emerged, not loud, not performative, not attention seeking, just stable. Stability does not trend well online, but it compounds in real life. Stable men became anchors in their own lives, and sometimes in the lives of others, but on their own terms. This stage also forced a reevaluation of companionship itself. Men began asking harder questions. Does this connection add clarity or confusion? Does it support growth or distract from it? Does it respect my time and resources? These questions replace fantasies with assessments. Romance did not disappear, it matured. Importantly, this recalibration did not make men hostile to women. It made them selective about dynamics. Respect replaced pursuit. Curiosity replaced pressure. Boundaries replaced desperation. These changes often improved interactions when both parties were aligned, but they also ended interactions quickly when alignment was absent. Efficiency replaced endurance. There is a lesson here that extends beyond gender. Any system that relies on guilt, shame, or obligation to sustain participation is unstable. Once participants discover they can leave without catastrophe, the system collapses. Voluntary systems require mutual benefit to survive. As men stabilized internally, they also became less reactive to external narratives. News cycles, outrage, and viral arguments lost relevance. Real life demanded attention. Savings accounts, health metrics, personal goals, and long term plans replaced social validation as measures of success. This inward focus insulated them from manipulation. This phase is where peace becomes addictive. Not the absence of challenge, but the absence of unnecessary chaos. Once experienced, peace becomes a baseline rather than a reward. Anything that threatens it is scrutinized carefully. This makes re entry into chaotic dynamics unlikely without clear benefit. It is also during this phase that many men realized they were not alone. Quietly, others were making similar choices, not through coordination, but through convergence. Shared conditions produce shared outcomes. This silent alignment reinforced confidence in the direction taken. As economic uncertainty continues, the stabilization phase will expand. More people will prioritize resilience over romance, clarity over chemistry, and balance over spectacle. This does not mean love disappears. It means love becomes more grounded. The final irony is that walking away may ultimately create the conditions for healthier connection. When people no longer need each other financially, they can choose each other freely. That freedom is the foundation of genuine partnership. As the stabilization phase deepens, its effects begin extending beyond individual lives and into broader social structures. Because when enough people change how they think and behave, systems adapt whether they want to or not. What began as personal financial restraint slowly transforms into cultural recalibration. Expectations shift, norms soften, assumptions lose their authority. And once assumptions lose authority, they are replaced by negotiation rather than obligation. One of the most significant long term consequences of this shift is the erosion of automatic trust. Not trust in people as individuals, but trust in narratives. Men who walked away learned, often the hard way, that widely accepted stories about effort, reward, and reciprocity were incomplete at best. This did not make them cynical, it made them evidence driven. Trust, once broken, does not disappear forever, but it becomes conditional. Conditional trust is not hostility, it is prudence. This change has profound implications for how relationships are formed and sustained. Courtship becomes slower and more deliberate. Financial discussions happen earlier. Expectations are clarified instead of implied. What once might have felt awkward is now seen as responsible. Transparency replaces performance. This reduces misunderstanding, even if it reduces romance as it was previously imagined. But romance built on illusion was always fragile. Another ripple effect appears in how men think about legacy and long term planning. Without the assumption that partnership will automatically provide meaning, men begin constructing purpose independently. This includes career trajectories chosen for sustainability rather than prestige, living arrangements optimized for peace rather than impression, and social circles built around shared values rather than convenience. Meaning becomes internally sourced rather than externally granted. Family structures are also affected by this recalibration. When financial responsibility is no longer assumed but negotiated, decisions around cohabitation, marriage, and children become more intentional. Fewer people rush into arrangements they are not prepared to sustain. While this may reduce participation rates in the short term, it increases stability among those who do choose to participate. Stability matters more than volume. This shift also influences how men perceive risk. Previously, emotional and financial risk were often intertwined, creating situations where saying no felt dangerous. Walking away separated those risks. Men learned that declining one arrangement does not eliminate all future options. In fact, it often improves them. This understanding reduces fear driven compliance across many areas of life, not just relationships. As fear diminishes, authenticity increases. Men become more honest about their limits, preferences, and goals. They are less likely to promise what they cannot sustain. This honesty can initially be interpreted as bluntness, but over time, it creates clearer alignment. Fewer misunderstandings mean fewer resentments. Fewer resentments mean fewer dramatic endings. Another subtle but important outcome is the redistribution of emotional labor. Men who no longer feel obligated to manage expectations stop absorbing emotional volatility that is not theirs to carry. This does not mean emotional detachment. It means emotional responsibility is shared rather than outsourced. Healthy connection requires both parties to regulate themselves. That principle is gaining ground. This redistribution also affects communication. Conversations become more grounded. Emotional expression is balanced with accountability. Discomfort is acknowledged rather than avoided. These changes improve the quality of interaction even when they reduce frequency. Quality, again, replaces quantity. From a societal perspective, this recalibration challenges institutions that relied on predictable patterns of male spending. Marketing strategies lose effectiveness, social scripts lose influence, businesses adjust or disappear. This is not a moral judgment, it is an economic one. Systems survive by aligning with consumer behavior, not by insisting behavior revert. As these changes continue, younger generations observe and adapt early. They do not inherit the same illusions. They enter adulthood with clear expectations and stronger boundaries. While this may appear guarded, it is often healthier. They have watched what happens when boundaries are absent. They have seen the cost of compliance without clarity. There is also a shift in how men relate to time. Urgency fades, patience increases. Long term thinking replaces short term gratification. This patience reduces susceptibility to pressure and manipulation. When time is no longer perceived as scarce, leverage disappears. This psychological shift is one of the most durable aspects of walking away. Importantly, none of this requires antagonism. The narrative that frames this shift as conflict misunderstands its nature. This is not a battle between groups, it is a correction between incentives and outcomes. When incentives are misaligned, participation declines. When alignment returns, participation resumes under new terms. This is where adaptation becomes the defining factor. Those who adapt expectations to reality find opportunity. Those who resist experience frustration. Resistance often manifests as outrage, but outrage does not change incentives. Only adjustment does. As trust becomes conditional and clarity becomes standard, the social environment grows quieter but more stable. Less spectacle, fewer crises, more negotiation. This environment does not generate viral moments, but it generates sustainable lives. Men who walked away did not do so to be remembered. They did it to live better. That choice reshaped their priorities and, by extension, the systems around them. Quiet decisions multiplied across millions have louder consequences than any protest. At this point, the discussion naturally turns towards strategy, not in the sense of manipulation or games, but in the sense of personal governance. Once illusions fall away, individuals are forced to manage their lives deliberately rather than reactively. This is where maturity replaces momentum. Momentum carries people forward without asking where they are going. Maturity asks whether the destination is worth the cost. For men who have stabilized after walking away, the guiding principle becomes sustainability. Every choice is filtered through a simple question: can I maintain this without sacrificing my peace, financial stability, or long term goals? If the answer is no, the choice is declined without anger or explanation. This internal filter replaces external pressure, and once installed, it is rarely removed. Engagement under this framework looks different. Interest is expressed calmly. Boundaries are stated early. Expectations are discussed rather than assumed. There is no rush to impress because impressing is no longer the objective. Alignment is. This reduces wasted time dramatically. Many interactions end quickly, not because of conflict, but because incompatibility is identified early and accepted without resentment. And one of the most powerful changes in this phase is the separation of desire from obligation. Men allow themselves to want without feeling required to provide. Attraction is acknowledged without triggering spending. Curiosity exists without immediate commitment. This separation restores balance because it prevents escalation driven by fear of loss. When escalation is optional, it becomes intentional. This approach also changes how men respond to rejection. Rejection is no longer interpreted as a verdict on worth, it is treated as information. Information does not wound, it informs. This emotional neutrality makes disengagement clean rather than bitter. Clean disengagement preserves dignity on both sides. Another critical aspect of operating in this new equilibrium is financial transparency, both internal and external. Internally, men maintain clear awareness of their resources, obligations, and limits. Externally, they are willing to communicate boundaries without apology. This clarity prevents misunderstandings that previously led to resentment. It is important to note that transparency does not mean disclosure of everything. It means honesty about what one is willing and able to offer. Mystery is no longer used as leverage. Ambiguity is no longer romanticized. Clear terms replace implied expectations. This recalibrated approach also reshapes social circles. Men gravitate toward peers who respect boundaries and value stability. Performative relationships fade. Mutual respect becomes the entry requirement. This often leads to smaller but more reliable networks. Reliability matters more than popularity when uncertainty rises. Another shift in this phase is the rejection of rescue narratives. Men no longer see themselves as saviors, nor do they seek saving. This mutual rejection of rescue removes a common source of imbalance. Relationships formed under this framework are cooperative rather than hierarchical. Cooperation scales. Hierarchy collapses under pressure. As individuals internalize these principles, emotional regulation improves. Fewer spikes, fewer crashes, less drama. Drama thrives on dependency and urgency. Stability starves it. This does not mean life becomes dull, it means it becomes navigable. From a broader perspective, this phase marks the normalization of walking away. What was once considered extreme becomes ordinary. Saying no becomes socially acceptable. Declining participation without justification becomes normalized. This cultural permission further reduces pressure to conform. This normalization also exposes those who rely on pressure to extract value. When pressure fails, such dynamics dissolve quickly. Voluntary engagement replaces coerced participation. This is healthier for everyone involved, even if it reduces short term gains for some. Another element of forward strategy involves time allocation. Men become protective of their schedules. Time is treated as a finite resource rather than a filler. Invitations are evaluated against personal priorities. This reduces burnout and increases satisfaction. Importantly, this does not make men inflexible. It makes them deliberate. Flexibility remains, but it is chosen rather than demanded. Chosen flexibility strengthens connection. Forced flexibility breeds resentment. As men operate from this position, they often find that when they do choose to invest, the investment is more appreciated. Scarcity of attention increases its value. Selectivity increases respect. This is not manipulation, it is a natural outcome of discernment. Another significant change is how conflict is handled. Men no longer engage in prolonged arguments to prove worth or to commitment. Disagreements are addressed directly. If resolution is not possible, disengagement occurs without escalation. This preserves energy and dignity. This phase also includes the acceptance of solitude as a neutral state rather than a failure. Solitude is no longer feared, it is recognized as a baseline. Connection becomes an enhancement, not a requirement. This reframing eliminates desperation and reduces susceptibility to unhealthy dynamics. As economic uncertainty persists, these strategies provide resilience. Individuals who operate with clarity and boundaries adapt faster. They absorb shocks better. They recover quicker. They are less reactive to external turbulence. The long term implication is a quieter but sturdier social fabric, fewer extreme highs, fewer catastrophic lows, more consistency. This may not satisfy those who crave intensity, but it supports longevity. The final irony is that this approach often attracts healthier connection organically. When people are stable, self directed, and unpressured, they become easier to engage with. Stability is magnetic, even if it is understated. As everything comes together, what stands out most is not anger, not blame, and not conflict, but inevitability. The shift we have been discussing did not require coordination, leadership, or slogans. It emerged naturally from pressure meeting reality. When systems demand more than they return, participation declines. When expectations grow without consent, compliance erodes. This is not ideology, it is equilibrium reasserting itself. Men walking away was never about proving a point, it was about restoring internal order. When external demands overwhelm internal capacity, something must give. In this case, what gave was unquestioned participation. What replaced it was discernment. Discernment is quiet, but it is powerful. It does not argue, it decides. The most important takeaway from this entire conversation is that nothing was taken away. Men did not remove generosity from the world. They removed it from situations where it was expected without appreciation. They did not reject connection. They rejected imbalance. They did not abandon responsibility. They abandoned responsibility that was not shared. This distinction matters because it reframes the narrative from conflict to correction. Corrections are uncomfortable, but they are necessary. Without correction, systems collapse entirely. With correction, they stabilize. What we are witnessing now is not collapse, but stabilization after a period of excess and distortion. For years, many people believed that social progress meant removing obligation from one side while quietly preserving entitlement for the other. That belief was unsustainable. Equality without reciprocity is not equality. Independence that still relies on subsidy is not independence. Those contradictions survived only as long as resources were plentiful. Once conditions tightened, Reality reclaimed its role. Men who walked away did not do so to punish anyone. They did it to protect their future. They looked at their finances, their emotional energy, their time, and their goals, and they made decisions accordingly. Those decisions were not dramatic, they were methodical, and that is why they endured. The silence that followed was misunderstood. Silence was interpreted as bitterness when in reality it was peace. Peace does not need to announce itself. It simply exists, and once experienced, it becomes the standard against which everything else is measured. This is why there is no mass return to old patterns. The old patterns required constant justification, constant performance, constant sacrifice with uncertain return. The new patterns require clarity, balance, and consent. Once clarity replaces confusion, confusion loses its appeal. It is also why appeals to emotion fail to reverse this shift. Emotion can motivate action briefly, but it cannot sustain imbalance. Guilt can coerce compliance temporarily, but it cannot override arithmetic. Fear can rush decisions, but it cannot build stability. Stability is built through alignment, not pressure. As we look forward, the path is clear even if it is not universally welcome. Relationships will become fewer, but stronger. Spending will become intentional rather than symbolic. Attraction will be grounded in compatibility rather than performance. These changes reduce spectacle, but they increase resilience. For those willing to adapt, this new landscape offers opportunity to build relationships based on mutual respect, opportunity to create lives that are sustainable rather than performative, opportunity to engage freely rather than compulsively. For those unwilling to adapt, frustration will continue, not because anyone is withholding something from them, but because expectations remain disconnected from reality. Reality does not negotiate, it simply responds. The final irony is that many of the outcomes people fear will never happen because walking away was not abandonment, it was recalibration. Men did not disappear, they reallocated. They did not withdraw from life, they withdrew from imbalance. And in doing so, they modeled something important. That self respect is not loud. Boundaries do not require explanation. And peace is worth protecting, even if it means disappointing those who benefited from your lack of boundaries before. This moment will be remembered not for outrage, but for quiet change. Years from now, people will look back and wonder why expectations were ever so misaligned. They will assume this balance was always normal. That is how corrections work. Once complete, they fade into the background as common sense. The lesson here applies to everyone. Build your life so that participation is a choice, not a requirement. Build relationships that add value rather than extract it. Build systems that respect limits rather than exploit generosity. When you do, stability follows naturally. Hard times are not the enemy, they are the teacher. They reveal what matters, what lasts, and what was never sustainable to begin with. Those who listen adapt, those who resist struggle. This has always been true, and it remains true now. As we close this conversation, remember that walking away was not the end of the road. It was the clearing of it. What lies ahead is quieter, steadier, and more intentional. It may not generate headlines, but it builds lives that endure. Now, I want to hear from you. What did you think about what was discussed today? Do you agree with this assessment? Have you seen these changes happening around you? Leave a comment and share your thoughts because these conversations matter most when they include real experience. Like the video, if you like it, do not forget to subscribe. And if you like the video, share the video. And just remember that all roads lead to MWA, men walking away, and cheers.
Nothing says you care like crypto. Nothing can compare. Nothing says you care like crypto. Oh, nothing can compare to crypto.